The latest on The Voice coming up with Victorian MP Moira Deemy. The No Camp's push to really ramp up the fight in South Australia and Tasmania, that two critical states in what's left of this campaign. Plus more news today on Australia's record-breaking migration intake. But first, let's go to the UK, where Prime Minister Rishi Sunak has announced a major U-turn on his government's climate commitments. Sunak has confirmed the UK is going to push back the deadline for selling new petrol and diesel cars and the phasing out of gas boilers. He took the knife too to a raft of other green commitments, so much so he's earned condemnation from green activists worldwide, which says to me he's got to be doing something right. Joining me now to discuss this, Australian newspaper's environment editor, Lloyd. Well, I was cheering from the sidelines, I have to say, for a bit of common sense coming into climate policy. This is quite extraordinary. It's a major U-turn right across the board in a range of commitments. I made the point at the top of the show, Graham, not just left over from another government, but of course, these are Tory commitments. This is a Tory leader radically changing and pushing back these deadlines. What do you make of it all?
Well, it's a very interesting development, Peter, and the significance is the admission that there's a disconnect between what the political class has promised and what local people were expecting. They can't afford it and they don't like it. There's been a sort of growing civil disobedience around the cost of living pressures of higher energy prices, and it's significant that the action's really centred on two things. One is this controversial issue of gas boilers in people's homes, where people were told that they have to use more expensive and less efficient ways to heat the houses when they can't afford to do it anyway. And the second is that they'll push back the mandate that people have to shift to electric battery cars. The truth is, with the electrical vehicle mandate, people don't want to buy the cars. The lots are filling up and they're about to be inundated with cheap imports from China. So it's not only consumers, it's industry saying we are doing ourselves a great deal of self-harm here. We need to change tack.
What's telling, I think, here too is Sunak, for those who don't follow UK politics closely, I mean, he's got his back to the wall politically. He's odds on to lose the next election. Labor's well and truly ahead in the polls. So the fact that he's taking on this fight says to me he's reading that there's community support here for a more rational and sensible climate response. And so I think the days of political leaders thinking all voters want, climate action, regardless of the cost to the economy, regardless of the cost to say, energy security, I think that's over. I think it's all got to be now seen through the prism of how this might impact individual households. Can we sell it to households? I don't think people have signed up to the green dream anymore.
Well, I think this is the test that's sort of looming large for governments everywhere. There's been this assumption that because people say they want to save the planet, they also want to pay for it or inconvenience themselves. And I think focus groups have always shown that that's not the case. It's consistent that people are prepared to pay a very small amount of money to actually affect change. And if you look at the UK situation, they've been enthusiastic embracers of the net zero. The meeting in Glasgow really galvanised everybody to sort of coalesce and try and get the rest of the world on board. And over the last couple of years, I think they've sat down and they've looked at where they are. They've looked at what's happening in Germany. They're looking at protests in the Netherlands. And politicians survive on public mandate. So there's two routes. One is you give way to public sentiment, and the other is you have an authoritarian bent. And thankfully, Sunak seems to be going down the look, let's concede.
I think this is where, on this issue, Glasgow is where Scott Morrison lost the most bark. I think that's where, the Labor people are against him anyway. They're not going to vote for him over what they imagined were all these things going on in Canberra regarding women and other things. But I think he lost a lot of skin on the whole issue of net zero and that Glasgow commitment. I think he lost his base on that issue. And now you've got the issue of renewables. which Labor thought would be an absolute winner. I mean, they keep telling everyone renewables are cheap, nothing cheaper than wind and solar. But as it's being rolled out, as these towers are turning up into communities, I mean, you wrote about the marine issues with these offshore wind farms this week in the paper. But as all of this is happening and it's real to people, they're seeing it in their towns and their communities, that support's falling away here in Australia as well.
I think that's really the evidence that's coming to the fore. The public protests to this rollout shouldn't be underestimated, and the problem is, for the government, it's vital that these things happen or there be a plan B. Chris Bowen has shown he's determined not to accept any deviation. Greg Combet has been brought in to really coordinate things and marshal the superannuation funding into it. But it all relies ultimately on public acceptance. And there's no evidence that that is going to be anywhere near as smooth as they would have hoped.
I mentioned, you touched on the whole issue of these offshore wind farms. I mean, they are massive. But I've got some figures for people at home that suggest that every single one of the turbines in the country, right around Australia, gets something in the order of $600,000 a year in subsidies per annum, even though they only provide us with power 25% of the time. This is madness.
Yeah, this is why Warren Buffett said, look, these things are great as a tax break. People have really invested in this sort of stuff because it's government money that's spent to prop it up. They're always telling government, look, it's going to be cheaper, it's going to be cheaper. In fact, those costs don't seem to be falling for the taxpayer. The 25% is sort of reflects that they don't work all the time. So you can say you've got this massive amount of megawatt hours installed, but the amount of power that comes out of it is only a fraction of that, and you can't actually determine with any precision how much it's going to be. So this is the difficulty for the planners of the electricity system to try and make that work. And unfortunately, you know, there's a preference that has been given to dispatch for these things, which just makes the challenge greater.
Graham, you talk about, you know, issues with whales. We know in Tasmania, Bob Brown and others have raised real concerns about wind turbine towers and eagles. I guess my other worry too is, where is the decommissioning plan for all of this kit? I mean, those towers will last us 15 years tops. That's what the recent report from Siemens says. We might get 20 years out of these great big seas of solar farms out on the land. But who's going to come and take them away and put them into a recycling plan of some order and give us our landscape back? What's going to happen?
Well, this is right. And if you think particularly on the onshore wind developments, each turbine has a massive concrete bunker underneath it, which is never going to be taken away. Recycling is a huge issue. The cost of decommissioning is something that really hasn't been addressed.
No, it hasn't. And most of these companies are foreign. They'll take the subsidies, they'll take the profits, and we'll be left with the mess. Graham, Lloyd, thank you as always.